to the surprise of no one, Dracula has returned. By 1991, there were already a handful of Castlevania games spanning over 200 years, all involving Dracula. He just doesn't stay dead thanks to one rule or another. In Christopher Belmont's timeline on the Game Boy, 15 years have passed since the events of Castlevania the Adventure, when a bat flew away from the ruins of Dracula's castle. Here in Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge, the better and overlooked Castlevania 2, a story preview on the title screen attempts to explain how Dracula has returned once again. He's using the power of Christopher's son, Soleil, and suddenly 4 castles appear. The text crawl is obnoxiously slow, with a poorly chosen flickering effect as it fades in and out, and the plot is a lackluster excuse for why Christopher is exploring new castles. Fortunately, that isn't a true preview for the game we're about to play, and the prologue music is fantastic as expected. Konami improved on their previous Game Boy Castlevania soundtrack and used sounds that I didn't even know were possible with the system. New to the Castlevania series is a stage selection, creatively using an animated bat as a cursor. This format was popularized by the Mega Man series, although it wasn't too effective in Belmont's Revenge. The names of each castle aren't displayed until after you make a decision, and there's no strategy in choosing a different order, so I played in the default sequence. The top left stage is Crystal Castle, and since it was on the left of the selection screen, the stage starts by going from right to left, showing a nice attention to detail. I'm pleased to tell you that Christopher has picked up some speed since his first game. Still slow, but much more appropriate, and the stages are now designed better around his movement. He also has the Fireball Whip again, if your whip is fully upgraded, and this time the fireballs seemed a little more useful. The whip no longer downgrades every time you take damage, although some enemies may still cause a regression. In addition, there are now 2 sub-weapons, the Throwing Axe and the Holy Water. At times, they felt like an afterthought because to me, the levels were designed with just the whip in mind, which I enjoyed from a perspective of not having to think too much. I didn't end up using any sub-weapons until the boss of my second castle, so it seems they weren't well integrated. The final improvement to the Game Boy series functions is that Konami brought back doors from the NES series. Sounds a little silly if you're unfamiliar, but it seems strange not to include them in Castlevania the Adventure. Doors are a symbol of checkpoints in a stage, and previously in The Adventure, the checkpoints were unclear and felt random. Each castle is split up into 5 or 6 sub-stages marked by these doors, and as is standard in the series, a death takes you back to your last door. Game overs would ordinarily cause you to restart the whole stage, in this case the whole castle, but Belmont's Revenge allows you to restart from the 3rd sub-stage if you've reached it already. I believe this is true for all stages, but I could be wrong about the longer ones. This is very unusual generosity in the series, and welcome for me. As is normal, every castle ends with a boss, and I defeated the boss of Crystal Castle without taking damage once. This was the default stage, and it makes sense to give it the easiest boss, but this boss is questionable. I had no idea what it even was, and apparently it's just a wizard, teleporting to 2 different spots and using a cloud to hit Christopher with lightning. Or at least try to. It's very easy to manipulate, and even though it bursts into flame when it hits the ground, even that is easy to dodge. I would also suggest putting a cloud-themed boss in the Cloud Castle, which is one of the 4 options. That's a harder level, so an easy boss wouldn't fit, but they had a lot of options with it, ultimately making choices that I don't understand. I then moved on to Rock Castle, which felt like a castle combined with a cave. It's the level with your obligatory way too fast jumping enemies, but I have to say this game handled that concept much better than other games. These enemies jump out from big holes in the wall, and you have the opportunity to whip them before they jump all over you. The most memorable part of the level is the sections with enemies that only move in the dark, and the room goes dark at random moments. Or so I thought. It actually goes dark when you break all the candles on the screen. It seems like that should be the obvious cause of darkness, but it wasn't because you're always breaking candlestick at items with no consequence. Before discovering the cause, the extended dark periods felt a little unfair as I fell into a pit that I couldn't see. The boss at the end of this castle has 2 phases, and the second phase isn't well balanced if you've never seen it. In the end, it jumps around in a pattern that you can learn once you've seen it, but probably after a few deaths. Next up is Plant Castle, a neat idea that the developers didn't really lean into enough. You could have so many dangerous and deadly plants in a spooky game like this, and they all seem to be missing. The middle section is very obnoxious, climbing all the ropes higher while avoiding the skeletons that have much better climbing ability. They almost found a way to make these Game Boy ropes feel more finicky than NES stairs, although I will admit that Christopher's jumps from ropes have improved from his first game. The only plants were covering the ground in certain sections, wriggling like tentacles and slowing Christopher down. I don't know if they pose any threat since I was always jumping through them to go faster. This stage introduces spiders hanging from the ceiling, and you can climb on their webs left behind when they descend. Just what I wanted, more ropes. The stage ends with 2 large statues that come to life, a cool boss to end a low point in the game for me. They still don't take much to defeat, and I have to question the theme again a little. Statues and gardens pair well together, but given how Plant Castle was presented, I personally think they would be slightly better suited in the Rock Castle. The final castle for me was Cloud Castle, and I need to warn anyone sensitive to flashing images to look away for a few seconds starting now. Wow, that background image would be great if I could see it every frame. This flickering is a bizarre choice and I don't like it. Okay, it's safe to look again. I won't be showing that anymore. Other than these glimpses out of the windows giving the feeling of being high in the air, the theme is unfortunately not conveyed well here. In terms of gameplay, the design is memorable for having a lot of moving parts, even moving ropes that functioned better than I expected. I still found some funk with them, but overall everything came together for a decent level. Another fun boss rounds off the stage, apparently called the Angel Mummy. I think I disagree with that assessment. It has 2 heads with long necks, and occasionally the bones are transferred between one another to alter their lengths. However, the developers may have overlooked how easy it is to avoid the bone attacks by crouching in certain spots. Well, that's all from the 4 castles that simply decided they existed one day. Now how about a 5th? With no extra plot whatsoever, it seems that clearing the first 4 castles is what it takes for Dracula's castle to appear. Christopher now has another 2 stages to get through, with a slightly raised difficulty, but still balanced more than you would expect from the Castlevania series. The background outside the castle as the level begins is stellar. Konami really figured out how to use the system's lack of color in the best way possible. A dangerous ascent up a tower awaits, fortunately without too many rope jumps. And then, would you believe it, a small descent. The stage ends with a confusing puzzle. You would usually think to go up this rope, but if you do that, the section will loop over and over. The trick was to go down the rope all along, and continue down a few screens. I was lucky not to get stuck here. At the end of the stage, Christopher encounters the Bone Dragon, a boss which moves between holes in the ceiling and floor while the screen constantly scrolls to the right. I don't mind the auto-scroll, in fact I think it heightens the sense of urgency. The dragon's pattern is the issue here. You can see which hole the dragon will emerge from, but that isn't enough. Its set pattern leaves Christopher in many situations that get him stuck between the dragon and the left side of the screen since his walk speed is too slow to sneak by at first. A thrilling idea lacking in execution. I love the look of the final stage. Instead of a haunted castle, it feels like a haunted chapel. The challenges in this level often reference challenges already presented in other levels, which can be lazy when it's done wrong. Fortunately, it was mostly made the right way in this game. It didn't choose all of my favorite elements, but chose some memorable ones, like these moving ropes, now with a little more getting stuck in the spikes above. It didn't feel as chaotic as I expected for the final stage, and my difficulty assessment of the main levels is that they're easier on average than we've seen in the series so far. And then we get to the end of the stage. That memorable moment of sudden difficulty in a Castlevania game. Here it is. This one outweighs the other bosses by far. No, it's not Dracula. It's Soleil. He taunts his father, saying he can't be destroyed, and it's too late to stop Dracula. Then he goes on to attack, leaving Christopher no choice but to fight back. The music sounds like something you would expect Bach to write if he composed for video games. Oh, he did write this. They used his song, and weirdly it works. The beginning sounds just as chaotic as the fight itself is. Yes, it's pure chaos, another of those things you'll need a long time to get used to. That game over system still gets in your way here, even if it's more lenient than before. Time is not on your side for learning how Soleil moves, and game overs will send you back and make you forget what you learned. There's a lot to learn in this pattern, and I'll admit it was fun once I understood it, eventually. Christopher finally beats the demon out of Soleil, literally, and since Dracula no longer has control, he now can only use the powers of the 4 castle spirits. Sure, plot, whatever you say. Dracula technically has a stage all to himself, with a long walk allowing Christopher to get a whip upgrade and anything else he may need for the fight, without any enemies in the way. The battle takes place in a room with several platforms, and Dracula can appear on any one of them. Only his head is vulnerable, and before he teleports to a new spot, he sends out a very powerful fire attack that you'll need to dodge. The save places change based on where Dracula appears, so this needs a lot of experimentation, and again, time to figure out. But this time, you have time. With this fight taking place in its own stage, game overs don't really mean anything anymore. Finally, I've been asking for this, and we have it at last. You can always get the whip upgrade and head straight back into the fight after a death, so there's no big penalty. Once you learn the best places to dodge all of Dracula's attack and weave your own attacks in between, this fight shouldn't be too much trouble. It feels odd having the fight end after just one phase, especially since it was finally made into its own stage. It could have gotten away with an even harder second phase with game overs out of the picture. When I cleared it, I had only taken damage once since my method all came together, and I actually wanted more. It's unusual for me to complain about Castlevania not being hard enough. Normally it's the other way around. I don't care for the plot at the end either, as I haven't throughout the game, but it's nice to see that Soleil has recovered and he joins his father to watch the castle crumble from a faraway cliff. It's like the ending of Castlevania the Adventure with a new look, and a surprisingly wholesome ending after the challenges they've been through. This is a good example of what the Game Boy can do for Castlevania given a little more time to adapt to the hardware. As a sequel to a very early Game Boy game, it made all the necessary changes, so Belmont's Revenge is more like what the adventure should have been. Then, there were some changes that I've wanted since the beginning of the NES series, so I was very satisfied. Konami was really finding their stride with this series. Dracula's Curse impressed me on the NES, and here Belmont's Revenge became a Game Boy standout. I think the stage designs slightly bring down the score, though not for the reasons you would expect in Castlevania. It's not excessive difficulty, it's the bland segments hidden in between the creativity and intricate visuals. Retro Castlevania fans might be disappointed by the lower difficulty of this game too. I enjoy the balanced difficulty of every stage, and I know that's because of a skill issue in the other games. This is hard to give a score for. Ultimately, I think beyond making all the improvements, there were opportunities to go for gold with this game, and they only aimed for silver. Therefore, my final score for Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge will be 7.2 out of 10. Maybe this is a rare Castlevania game that I can recommend to almost anyone because the difficulty isn't as high as other games in the series. The movement is slow to outsiders, so just believe me when I say it's an improvement over the first Game Boy title. Slow doesn't mean bad, and in fact it's fairly intuitive to control. It's short enough to play almost any time, and still doesn't feel too short considering it's on the Game Boy. And yes, it is available in Castlevania Anniversary Collection. It also had a new localization on the Game Boy Color as part of Konami Game Boy Collection Volume 4. Belmont's Revenge was covered in 8 pages of detail in Nintendo Power and was rated with an average score of 4 out of 5. Electronic Gaming Monthly's thoughts were on the same track, as all reviewers awarded it an 8 out of 10. I thought their comments were surprisingly harsh despite the score, and I disagree with those who said it was just a continuation rather than a sequel. Saying there wasn't anything new is a little ridiculous unless you consider the NES titles as well, which you probably shouldn't. By EGM standards, this game seemed undermarked. Tell me, did you agree with the points I've made? What rating would you give Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge for the Game Boy, initially released in 1991? Hit the like button to stop Dracula from rising again, and subscribe for more. As ever, thank you for watching, and please continue to be your own unique self.
Pennsylvania.